Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a Wilson Center Africa program event on challenges, lessons learned, and opportunities for peace building in Transboundary river basins, including the Eastern Nile Basin. My name is Gama Mute, and I am the Director's Office Program Assistant in the Wilson Center's Africa program. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Wilson Center, it was chartered by Congress in 1968 as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. The Wilson Center's Africa program works to address the most critical issues facing Africa and U.S.-Africa relations, but mutually beneficial U.S.-Africa relations, and enhance knowledge and understanding about Africa in the United States. Today's event is held under the banner of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding. Established in 2011 with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, or SVNP, is a continent-wide network of 22 African policy, research, and academic organizations that work with the Wilson Center's Africa program to bring African knowledge and perspectives to U.S., African, and international policy on peacebuilding in Africa. One of the main components of the network is the Research Scholarship Program. Scholars from member organizations are hosted by the Africa program here in Washington, D.C. for a 3-month residence scholarship program. The selected individuals complete a policy-oriented research project and engage with U.S. policymakers and practitioners. The scholars share their research findings with these policymakers and practitioners, while also bringing local context and knowledge into U.S. policy discussions. Today, SVNP scholar Yared Debebe Yetena will share the results of his research project with us. For those of you following us online, we are live tweeting today's event and taking questions on Twitter and via our website. To join the discussion, please tweet @AfricaUpClose using the hashtag Nile to engage in the discussion. If you are watching the webcast, you can submit your question into the box that says Submit a Question. Please include your name and affiliation. For those of you in person, if you would like to ask a question after all the speakers have completed their remarks, please raise your hand. You will be acknowledged and you will have a microphone handed to you. Please tell us your name and affiliation and keep your question or remark to 1 minute. We also have 2 more SVNP events after today. Tomorrow, an underappreciated tool, the role of traditional justice institutions in peacebuilding in Africa, with Mr. Awit Kase. On Tuesday, April 5th, Refugee Women's Inclusion in Peace Agreements and Peacebuilding in Africa, Challenges and Opportunities, with Sandra Tumwesije. Please see the Africa program website for more details. I would now like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Nancy Walker, who is the founding director of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies and member of the Wilson Center Africa Programs Advisory Council. She will set the stage for today's discussion and introduce our speakers. Over to you, Dr. Walker.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to our audience in person and virtually. We look forward to an interesting and informal discussion where we can all learn a lot. As Gamu said, the Wilson Center and the Southern Voices program is to support academic research that is rich and usable for the policymaker. A lot of times our colleagues in the academic world are not able to share the benefits of their expertise and their research and make it presented in a form that can be used by people who serve in governments, whether it is our own government in the United States or in international organizations. And I think that's one of the great successes of the Wilson Center, is being able to take scholars and research and put things in a context so that our policymakers can make the best decisions, whether they are in the executive or in the legislative branch. Today we are talking about water issues, river basin issues, and the example is the Nile River Basin, but as we know, water is a critical issue facing us, whether we are talking about climate, we are talking about security, my former employer, the good old Department of Defense. In the Pentagon, discussion of water as a security issue has been on the table for a long, long time. So that's not the only thing that we're concerned about, but water as an issue is a global challenge. And in looking at some of the transboundary areas, it is not only the Nile Basin, but we have water shortages in Yemen, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, transboundary disputes between Afghanistan and Iran, dam projects and disputes in the Mekong River Basin, disputes over the Coveri Basin in India, livestock prices, droughts in Somalia, Turkey, Armenia, water scarcity in water privatization in Bolivia. And this is just a simple list from, not being an expert in this, a simple Google. It tells you that our water issues are clearly a global challenge. So as Gamu said, the format is we're going to have 3 speakers. Let me introduce them to you, and then I will turn over the microphone to them. Agreements and frameworks have certainly sought to address the shared resource governance disputes over the years, and we are going to look at, today's example is the shared peacebuilding challenges of transboundary river basins, including the Eastern Nile River Basin. We're going to explore interventions and the kinds of frameworks that can be used by policymakers, and critically, we're going to offer some lessons learned and recommendations for shared water resources that could be accessible and understood and implemented by policymakers. Let me turn the floor over to our speakers. First, we have Mr. Carl Brook, is the Director of International Programs at the Environmental Law Institute and the founding president of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. He works on environmental peacebuilding, especially after conflict, environmental governance, adaptation, and emergencies. Much of his work focuses on water governance as is affected by conflict, disasters, and climate change. He's helped dozens of countries, including many conflict-affected countries throughout Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Europe, to strengthen their environmental laws, institutions, and practices. He's edited more than 10 books and authored over 80 journal articles, book chapters, and reports. Currently serves as an adjunct professor at the American University School of International Service. Mr. Brook holds a law degree from Northwestern School of Environmental Law of Lewis and Clark College and an MA in physics from the University of Texas in Austin and a BS in physics with additional majors in mathematics and anthropology from Michigan State University. Mr. Brook is also an example of the interdisciplinary focus that we so often forget about, the needs of how our scientists can inform the policy debate when Washington is a town full of master's degrees in international relations. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it is nice to know that we can bring this all together. Our second speaker is our SVNP scholar, Mr. Yared Debebe. He is a PhD candidate in the Peace and Security Studies program at Addis Ababa University, and since 2012, he's been a lecturer and researcher in the Peace and Security Studies program at the University of Gondar. He's also a DAAD alumnus, that's the German Academic Exchange Program, and a 2021 Civil Society Scholars Award Fellow. His wider research interests include nationalism, social movements, peace building, and post-conflict reconstruction. And our final speaker is Mr. Eric Wong, is currently the Ethiopia desk officer in the Office of East African Affairs at the United States Department of State. He's a Foreign Affairs officer with the State Department's Bureau of African Affairs and focused on Africa from 1997 to 2021, also on political, military, and security issues. His Africa experience includes serving in leadership positions at U.S. embassies in Rwanda, Djibouti, and Madagascar. He has also served as a senior advisor for the African Union Peacebuilding program in the Bureau of African Affairs and as the acting director of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research Office of Analysis for Africa. For a couple of years, most recently 2019 to 2020, he was detailed to the Department of Defense, as many of our Foreign Service officers do serve during their careers, as the foreign policy advisor for the U.S. Africa Command's Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa in Djibouti. He is a graduate of Yale College and holds a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University Schools of International and Public Affairs and a master's degree in national security strategy from the National War College. Prior to the State Department, Mr. Wong worked for the United Nations in New York and Mogadishu. He is from Los Angeles, as am I. I will look forward to learning more about that later. I would like to invite all of you virtually and in person to welcome our speakers. And this is one of the weird things about hybrid events. We don't have an auditorium full of we have an auditorium with enthusiastic members, but not full. So we will feel applauded from the ether across time zones and distances. Each of our speakers is asked to speak to specific aspects of the topic. And I would now like to ask Mr. Brook to start us off with his remarks. We have asked him to address what are the key causes and drivers of conflict and instability in transboundary river basins, and to provide an overview of any notable international interventions, again, putting this in the global context, and what are your top 3 lessons learned and recommendations for Africa, the United States, and international partners regarding water governance. Mr. Brook.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes, okay. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. In terms of the key drivers and causes of conflict in transboundary river basins, I think the Eastern Nile Basin is a classic example of political failure. This is not a technical issue. It's not a legal issue. We don't know how to resolve this. We do. There is no political will. It's what happens when inflexibility meets reality. The reality of population growth, the reality of development, the reality of climate change. So fundamentally, this is a political failure. Second is the lack of effective institutions for cooperation. Where there are no institutions for cooperation, where these institutions are very weak, like the Nile Basin Initiative, there is a higher level of conflict. Where institutions, especially those with some history of successful cooperation and trust building, exist, there's a platform for negotiating outside political discussions, so-called track 2 diplomacy. And this can help build trust. And we've seen some of that through the Nile Basin Initiative, but it's only, all we have is this softer cooperation. Third, institutions need to have capacity, both to cooperate and to manage disputes. Nile Basin Initiative has capacity to cooperate, but has no mandate to really manage the disputes and no power to manage those disputes. So there's a need for a legal framework in this space, one that goes beyond 2 nations agreeing to share the water between themselves. Finally, and this is something I don't hear a lot about, women are left out of the process. Data and experience shows that peace processes are more durable when women are involved. Water projects that we've seen with the World Bank, they're more successful, they're more sustainable when women are involved. There needs to be more consideration and active engagement of women in water diplomacy in the Nile Basin. In terms of notable international interventions, there are quite a few wonderful examples out there. A number of these have been facilitated by the Global Environment Facility, which supported starting in the 1990s, a series of transboundary processes for international rivers, international lakes, and even international aquifers. They helped create legal and institutional frameworks. And we've seen, outside of the Jeff example, we also have seen ongoing discussions, negotiation, and cooperation in the Jordan-Israel context throughout conflict, similar in the Indus Basin. And I think that's notable because of the World Bank engagement as a third party, both providing financial and technical assistance, and also, where necessary, some arm twisting. And there needs to be a willingness to try to twist arms here. Third-party support and facilitation is often important, as in the Indus Basin example, but can also backfire if it's not legitimate or not considered legitimate. The JEF is also an example of how joint issue diagnosis, visioning, and planning can help cooperation and build trust. The JEF has a process, a TDA SAP process, that really brought countries together to get a common understanding of what the water is, when it comes, what the factors affecting the water are, and how to manage it. And then ELI has been working with the Stockholm International Water Institute for 5 years to train women negotiators and build capacity of a network of women in water diplomacy in the Nile Basin. We provide training in negotiations, international water law, and technical issues. More importantly, though, I mean, the capacity is important, but the network, the connections and the mutual reinforcements, the relationships, this, we think, is even more important than the capacity that is built directly. They conduct joint research, they build relationships, and in the process, they raise their profile in the basin and in the basin discussions. Recommendations. I think the first is we need to invest in peace and cooperation. We need to push hard for an effective legal and institutional regime. We need to fund it generously. And we need to maintain pressure on parties to abide by it. In the design, we need to make sure that these investments are adaptive. Climate change and economic developments and political developments mean that we have to be looking at a much more flexible, much more adaptive approach than we have historically. It needs to be inclusive and it needs to be functional. One of the things that we saw in the Mekong Basin, countries committed to committing. They didn't actually commit. They said, we commit to committing, and we'll do that later. And now the prior notification, consultation requirements, those effectively been gutted. And this has undermined relations in the basin. It is important to have clear and firm commitments. I mentioned the importance of engaging women, so I'll close by saying it's also important to engage communities. Most of the international processes are nation to nation, and they have very little legitimacy or ownership or engagement of communities that live along the water, that are affected by it, and that can affect it. And we need to do a much better job of engaging them in the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought. And now we turn the floor over to Mr. Yared.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Walker.
Pleasure.
Let me begin with giving some introductory background to the Eastern Nile Basin. The Eastern Nile Basin is part of the greater Nile Basin, which incorporates 5 states. The first one, Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan, Sudan, and Egypt. And the Nile, more than 200 million people rely on the Nile waters. So as a result, access to the Nile waters has become a national security matter. So in my remarks today, I want to focus on the sub-basin as an overarching. In my remarks today, I want to focus on the sub-basin as an overarching security complex, which has been grappling with manifold peace-building challenges. So within the regional complex, I still focus on those challenges that stems from 3 factors, 3 sources. The first one is from the water governance. Second is on contest. Third is internal political instabilities. These are widely interlinked to the greater Nile problem. So my argument is while the Nile waters is the dominant problem or challenge of peace building in the Eastern Nile Basin, but the other 2 requires much attention. So let me go with first with the Nile dispute, and I will proceed to the other 2 peace building challenges of the region. The first, which is the Nile dispute, which is a water governance problem, which is a concern of hydropolitics and security discourse in the Eastern Nile Basin. And broadly, I can say that the Nile dispute through the years emanates from three major factors. The first one is from historical water sharing frameworks, which are perceived by some member riparian states gives greater influence and imbalance in the shared resource. Second is absence of post-independence water sharing strategies, water governance strategies. In this regard, it was only in 1999 that after years of negotiation and facilitation, which started by the United Nations Development Program in 1967, that these basin countries reached an agreement to establish a wider basin initiative, the Nile Basin Initiative. However, this initiative has not or has failed to realize some cooperative agreement to achieve the spirit of one river, one people, and one vision. And the third factor is, which is a recent development, which is related with the commencement of the construction of the Grand Renaissance Dam. So it is related with the disagreement over the filling operation of the GERD and the idea of concluding a binding water sharing agreement between the three countries, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. So the dam, some scholars argue, is an opportunity for collaboration. However, with the existing absence of anarchical water governance regime has created or has complicated the already fragile trust and relation among the three riparian countries. And the second peacebuilding challenge is border dispute. So these border disputes are inherited from colonial legacies or from colonial era, which has been posing some border governance challenge or frontier governance challenge in the Eastern Nile Basin. For example, if we look at Sudan, Sudan is in conflict, in dispute with Ethiopia over the Al-Fashaq Triangle, and is also in dispute over the Haliab Triangle with Egypt. So the critical point in terms of border dispute in the Eastern Nile Basin is this border dispute can draw on or could draw on or in neighboring and regional states with an interest in affecting the outcomes of the conflict and an interest in the conflict to achieve their own vested interests, which actually complicates the issue. And in addition, it also, or the border disputes also serve as a mechanism by individual riparian regimes to project their power over the larger Nile dam, the larger Nile issue, which adds more complexity to the situation of the Nile dispute. And the third peacebuilding challenge is internal political instabilities. So I want to tackle this problem from two angles. The first one is the mass protests, which we have witnessed in the last 10 years or so. And the second one is those precarious transitions that these states are undergoing. So Egypt, for instance, undergone this violent and sometimes peaceful transition, peaceful protest from 2011 up to 2012, which unseated the Mubarak's regime. And Ethiopia also experienced violent protests throughout 2015 to 2018. And Sudan also experienced similar violent and peaceful demonstrations, which led to the overthrow of al-Bashir regime in 2019. So with the exception of Egypt, whereby Egypt is now consolidating its post-Arab Spring political transition toward some kind of stability, the two countries are still undergoing precarious transitions. We can look at Ethiopia's current war in Tigray region, which later engulfed the Amara region, the Afar region. And we have also a war going on in the western part of Ethiopia, in Benishangul Gumuz, and also in western Oromia region. Sudan similarly is now in the 39 months of transition to a civilian rule and electoral democracy, but still Sudan is experiencing coup and waves of mass protests. So these internal political instabilities are often exacerbated by external interventions and meddling, which makes such domestic intricacies to have a regional structure. So what happens within these regional riparian states, it largely intersects with the myriad issue affecting all states in the region. So if these are the peace-building challenges, then what could be done? And these are my three recommendations. The first one is the African Union is now leading negotiation, a trilateral negotiation among the three riparian states to compromise on the Nile Basin and the dam dispute. So the African Union should encourage the three riparian countries to reach in a kind of short-term binding agreement, because the dam filling and other technical agreements are being reached. But still the problem that is puzzling the dam negotiation is the issue of binding agreement. So a short-term binding agreement would help because it may be for 5 years or 10 years. So over the Blue Nile water sharing, this not only builds trust among the three riparians, but also helps to evaluate them to the strengths and the weakness or the flaws of the terms of agreement, then incorporate changes in the next treaty. Because there is a fact that some binding water sharing agreements are currently facing unprecedented challenges that were never incorporated in the agreement, such as climate change and other factors which are signed in the 1960s and so on and so forth. And second is the border dimension of security in the region has not received that much attention. So Sudan and Ethiopia, as part of the IGAD region, IGAD should play a critical role through establishing high level of panel to investigate, to do some research on, for example, on the normative and historical background of the problem, and the population composition, and the potential areas of cooperation. And if needed, should help these two countries to agree on some demarcation mechanisms. And third is the African Union and other international organizations through their envoys are closely working with Ethiopia and the Sudanese government to sort out the solution to their internal political upheavals. This is a higher level of consultation. So the grassroots level still needs or requires attention from the civil societies to tackle the structural causes that leads to the protests, that makes the transition challenging. So that civil societies could weigh in such mechanism to help the community solve their problems at a community level. Then the power sharing and other things are being done so far. And finally, encouraging cooperative development projects on the Nile, specifically cooperative water development projects like investment in irrigation, agro-processing, hydropower helps to mitigate tensions and spread responsibility for water utilization. And this could be done by, for example, the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, the European Union, and the United States. So this is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now let us turn to our third speaker. And we have asked Mr. Wong from the State Department to talk about, hang on a second, what are the key causes and drivers? No, hang on a second. We want you to provide an overview of how the U.S. government is working on all of this, and to why the issues and the causes and drivers of insecurity in the countries within the Eastern Nile River Basin, and how do they fit into why it matters to the United States. And we ask you to provide your 3 top recommendations for U.S. and African partners to more effectively address the insecurity issues around shared water resource management. And the floor is all yours.
Thanks. So Mr. Brook talked about political will. Jared talked about political instability, and I too will talk a little bit about politics. So first I want to thank the Wilson Center for the invitation to participate in today's panel and to give the perspective of a generalist working on African issues at the Department of State on, as Nancy said, the key causes and drivers of insecurity in the countries of the Eastern Nile River Basin region, an example of what the United States government is doing to address that insecurity, and very broadly, some possible lessons learned or recommendations. First, on key causes and drivers of insecurity, one could broadly distinguish between internal and external factors. Internal factors could include such things as, and I think Yara discussed this in some detail, poverty, a past history of extreme violence or armed conflict, ethnic divisions, having to contend with rebel groups, armed militias, or insurgents, lack of good governance and weak democratic institutions on the one hand. An indicator of this might be, for example, susceptibility to coups, or on the other hand, conversely, entrenched autocratic leaders or regimes resistant to reform. External causes or drivers of insecurity, on the other hand, could also include threats from violent extremist or terrorist groups, ongoing territorial disputes, competition for natural resources, conflict minerals, oil, or, as other panelists have highlighted, water. For the Eastern Nile River Basin countries in particular, one might also add a third category of factors affecting insecurity, humanitarian challenges. Many of these are cross-border challenges and may be beyond the capacity of a single government alone to control, but a government's failure to act can exacerbate already existing insecurity. So for the Horn of Africa and for these countries, in particular, drought, locusts, COVID-19 can compound the challenge already posed by food insecurity and famine, or disease, malaria, cholera, even in the case of the DRC, Ebola. Climate change arguably magnifies the impact of some of these humanitarian challenges, and a combination of them could lead to further displacement and refugee flows. And water obviously plays an important role in addressing all of these challenges. Looking at the countries of the Eastern Nile River Basin through this lens, let me just highlight 2 factors that are prominent with regard to Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Sudan. One is poverty. The second is a history of armed conflict and ethnic tensions. Using the UN Human Development Index as an indicator of poverty, we can see that South Sudan is ranked near the bottom, at 185 out of 189 countries, with 91.9% of its population, according to the UN, in multidimensional poverty. Ethiopia, similarly, is ranked 173 out of 189, with more than 2/3, 68% of its population, in multidimensional poverty. Sudan is ranked 170, with 52% of its population in poverty. But in contrast, Egypt is ranked 116 by the UN Development Index, and only 5.2% of its population is considered to be in multidimensional poverty. Armed conflict and ethnic tensions exist in multiple Nile River Basin countries, but it is worth noting that the severity in 2 Eastern Nile River Basin countries, namely Sudan and South Sudan, has prompted the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to adopt them as case studies for genocide prevention. Ethiopia is not one of the Holocaust Memorial Museum's case studies, but Secretary of State Blinken highlighted the current conflict there when he spoke at the museum last week. He said, quote, "Atrocities committed in the conflict in Ethiopia have been committed by all parties as well as by Eritrean forces," end quote. Let me turn now to some brief examples of what the U.S. government is doing to bolster peacebuilding efforts in the basin, engaging with African partners to address water governance issues in the region. In 2017, the U.S. government adopted a U.S. government global water strategy with 4 objectives. They were increasing access to sustainable, safe drinking water and sanitation services, protecting freshwater resources, promoting cooperation on shared waters, and strengthening water governance and financing. To implement the global water strategy, USAID developed Water for the World priority country plans with a heavy focus on Africa. Of the 19 country plans, 13 are for countries in Africa, and 6 of those are for countries in the Nile River Basin, namely Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. The plan for Ethiopia highlights that 43 million Ethiopians lack access to clean water and 72 million lack access to improved sanitation. And the plan calls for a range of U.S. government activities in Ethiopia, from USAID and the Geological Survey implementing water exploration and hydrogeological studies, to USAID and the Forest Service, not the Foreign Service, the Forest Service, working to promote rangeland management and planning, and the Department of State training Ethiopian officials to use geographic information systems to map existing water resources and projected needs. But the United States is also promoting peacebuilding to address water governance by sponsoring scientific research on key water issues. As an example, USAID and Egypt's Ministry of Higher Education jointly fund the U.S.-Egypt Science and Technology Joint Fund, which is implemented in the United States by the National Academies of Science and in Egypt by the Egyptian government. Past research grants under this program have included such collaborative projects as agricultural sustainability and water reuse in Egypt, and natural discharge for agricultural development and a solution for reduced river Nile flow. Let me now conclude with some observations on possible lessons learned to more effectively address these issues. First, African countries have agency. Reform-minded leadership matters, particularly with regard to engagement with the United States and other responsible stakeholders in the international community. So, for example, look at the transition in Tanzania from President Magufuli to President Hassan. In DRC, the transition from President Kabila to Tshisekedi. And in South Sudan, consider how the death of John Garang perhaps altered that country's trajectory. For the future in the Nile River Basin, I ask you to consider the implications of a post-Isaias Eritrea, a post-Kagame Rwanda, even a post-Museveni Uganda. And I stress, I am not calling for regime change, but for analysis of long-term scenarios. Secondly, the effects of insecurity can be a vicious cycle. Lags in socioeconomic development lead to a diversion of resources away from social needs, the classic guns versus butter trade-off. A youth bulge coupled with unemployment can make the population susceptible to recruitment by violent extremist organization. This can lead to a deterioration of human rights, armed conflicts, IDPs, and refugee flows. This in turn can deter private investment, and the cycle continues. A corollary observation or question for an analysis then might be, at what point in this cycle are interventions by the United States or international communities most effective? Do sanctions, which are a key tool of U.S. policy, come at the right time to be most effective? And then the third and final observation or lesson learned is, how best should the United States structure its intervention to address the potential problem of forum shopping and seams? So as the English Romantic poet William Blake once observed, I must create my own systems or be enslaved by another man's. The African Union and its member states observe the principle of subsidiarity, referring to the appropriate regional economic community, or REC, to take the lead on a particular issue. But what is the appropriate REC, particularly if a country belongs to multiple ones? Can RECs play an effective role in promoting good governance, or is their role primarily to promote economic integration? In Western Africa, Nigeria and Senegal led ECOWAS when it pressured President Jammeh to respect elections and to depart Gambia. But in the Nile Basin, what countries would play that role? There's also the challenge of seams, which arise when geographic regions overlap or have some redundancy. It's a challenge for the UN system. Some of the Nile countries are under the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Addis. Others are part of the Economic Commission for Southwest Asia in Beirut. It's also a challenge for the US military. Should the US military engage with countries in the region through AFRICOM, the US Africa Command, or Central Command? Which strategy of the United States should have primacy? A Horn of Africa strategy, a Red Sea strategy, or an Indian Ocean strategy? And indeed, external actors are creating their own fora, literally, to engage with Africa. This includes the Red Sea Forum, created by Saudi Arabia and joined by a number of countries in the region, FOCAC under China, TCAD under Japan, the Russia-Africa Forum, La Francophonie, the Commonwealth. And I ask you, what is the United States doing in contrast or comparison? So in conclusion, I leave it to the audience to consider whether existing institutions are effectively addressing water governance issues or whether there is room for improvement to promote peace and security in the Eastern Nile River Basin region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers before we turn to question and answer. Thank you all. We have questions that are coming in, but we would like, coming in, it's all very high tech. Does anybody here in the audience, may I invite you to ask a question before we turn to questions that are coming in from online? We'll come back to you. Do you have questions for each other before we turn to others? Please do not hesitate.
I don't know if this is a question, but
Close to the microphone.
I don't know if it's directly a question, but I'm curious what others think about this. In our analysis and recommendations, we've been focusing on the problem at hand. I see another problem, the war in Ukraine. And I think about 2010, when there were wildfires in Russia. These were so extensive that Putin banned the export of grain from Russia. Price of bread skyrocketed across the region. And 3 months later, you saw Arab Spring. Now, it wasn't caused by the rise in price of bread, but that was an exacerbating factor. We now have a very tense situation. And not only do we have bread, but also vegetable oils and other products that are likely to go through the roof. Maybe a short-term strategy would be to think about how do we mobilize food to keep this region from not getting worse in the coming months. And I'm just wondering if this is on people's radars, what you think about it. It doesn't solve the underlying problem. It's just trying to keep it from escalating.
Yara, do you have some thoughts? Or do you want to think about that for a minute?
Yeah, let me think about
Okay.
Well, I would just say that obviously the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is a grave one, and in a world of finite resources, additional crises deter from what the international community can do. I think some analysts have highlighted that Russia and Ukraine are the primary producers of grain, and so conflict in that area could reduce grain supplies and could cause food insecurity in Africa. So no, I do agree it's a concern for the region.
But I'm wondering, is there something we can do if that risk is coming, rather than wait to see what happens in terms of, USAID does wonderful things moving food aid into countries.
I think, yeah, I'm gonna exercise the moderator's prerogative to turn to our questions, but you have given us a huge amount to think about, and that's one of the exciting things about pulling together scholars and practitioners. We'll come back to you. One of the first questions that has come in from online is, could you suggest some specific recommendations for increasing local ownership of shared water governance decision-making? As some of you have highlighted that it is often done at the state-to-state level, but what specific recommendations might you have in looking at local ownership? The second question I would like you to consider is, what have been successful examples of water security or resource security more broadly, of interventions that have successfully included women, and what can we learn from such examples? That's question number 2. I can repeat that if you'd like. What have been successful examples of water security or resource security interventions that have included women, and what can we learn? And then number 3 is, how can future agreements and frameworks effectively build in climate change mitigation or adaptation mechanisms to ensure that they can be lasting in their impact? So, number 1, recommendations for local ownership. Number 2, women. Number 3, climate. Who would like to go first? I think our scholar would like to start us off, or would you like to use an American sports metaphor, bat cleanup, as in take the final position after your distinguished panelist colleagues? What's your preference?
Let me reflect on the first and the last question.
Okay.
The specific water recommendations that will be effective or efficient to agree on, or at the local level, or at the local level, what kind of water sharing agreements could be reached at the Eastern Nile Basin. I think if we look at the Eastern Nile Basin, the waters from the Nile Basin, they come from the Blue Nile and the Takazi River and the Baro River. So these rivers are very huge rivers. So it will be very difficult for the local community in the border areas of, like, for example, Ethiopia and Sudan, Ethiopia and South Sudan to collaborate and to develop some developmental projects. But yet, still, international organizations could help this the local community to work on, like, developmental projects like agro-processing, or maybe other developmental projects that could be viable to the local communities. But the major thing is these huge tributaries and waters, they need some basin agreements and legal agreements. And what are the future?
Hang on one second. Let's keep all of you other contributions to the question first of local ownership. Do you have some thoughts?
On local ownership, I would just say, the water strategy of the United States highlights actions to be taken by 17 U.S. government agencies. So it's not simply the Department of State and USAID. And obviously in countries in the Nile River Basin region and indeed the world, the Peace Corps, USAID, various offices within USAID, the Office of Transition Initiatives, all play a role working with local communities.
In addition to the Forest Service.
In addition to the Forest Service, yes.
I would also like to highlight the example between U.S. and Canada. There's what's called the International Joint Commission. These all have different basin-specific sub-bodies, and when there are decisions that might affect that, there is public consultation. In parallel, there's an NGO called Great Lakes United. So when there were proposals to redirect water from the Great Lakes to float barges down the Mississippi, the Great Lakes United held hearings around the Great Lakes with the communities. The Canadian government, the U.S. government attended. It was not an official thing, but they just attended and listened. And afterward, they decided, no, we're not going to do this. And so there can be both formal processes and informal processes. And I think it's really important for donors to be supporting the informal processes while also creating the opportunities for public consultation around specific decisions.
Thank you. Let's turn to the, you wanted to address the second question about women, or what was the?
So specific sorry, please go ahead.
Maybe the climate change.
Climate change, go for it.
Yeah, I think in related to climate change, looking at previous water agreements signed in the 1960s between, for example, Pakistan and India, and other water agreements, they are now facing this unprecedented challenge of climate change. So when writing these terms of agreement in water corporations, the technical committees should give much emphasis to what the future holds in terms of the climate change, how the climate change affects the water flow, and so on and so forth. So, going back to the specific local ownership, let me add a couple of points, specifically in related to the Eastern Nile Basin between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, specifically between Ethiopia and Sudan. The boundary is a very porous boundary, sparsely populated, and there is also an ongoing armed conflict in this region. So it is very difficult for such mechanisms to apply at that point.
Thank you. Do you want to add something?
Well, yeah, just to comment about women and local communities. I think we're drawing possibly a false dichotomy between dealing with political elites and national leaders on the one hand and local communities and women on the other. And a lot of the work that the United States is doing, I think, through its democracy and governance programs is trying to make sure that governments are representative, so that when we're dealing with national leaders, we're dealing with people who do represent the interests of communities and leaders who are women, for example.
Did you want to add something? I sense that.
Two things. One, I think that national leaders are generally the democratically elected representatives, but they are the representatives of the country, not of the communities. And often communities along international rivers that form boundaries, they have more in common with one another than they do with the capitals. And so the capitals have often a high politics relationship. And so I think that it's really important to be engaging in this way, but I also think we need to be, it's not, even dealing with democratically elected governments, they don't always represent, they may be representing broader interests than just the communities. On the adaptation question, Aaron Wolf did some fascinating work looking at water agreements around the world and found that almost none of them thought about climate change. They set the limits based on a particular year. And we have all sorts of problems. You know, some of it is there's going to be less water. One of the things that we don't, and we usually think about total amount of water and who's going to get how much water, but there's also the question of when's the water coming? And we're seeing that it comes more in short bursts, which means floods, so it's not just a question of using water, it's disaster management and communications. And you know, if South Africa is going to open their dams so that they don't overtop, it'd be really helpful if they could let Mozambique know that they're going to do it and people can get to safety. So this sort of, I think that there are questions of data sharing. I think we need to be looking at the language. Some of it's reallocation, short-term or long-term, and that's going to be a painful discussion. But even if you can't agree on that, let's be talking about notification with regards to floods and release of dams. And the other thing is cooperation where there's easily agreement, say around water efficiency and investment in water efficiency technologies to try to reduce the stresses on the water.
What about water pollution?
Absolutely.
That a part and parcel, it's not just the amount of water, it's not just when the water comes, it's not just efficiency, but it's how good is the water.
And that's something that I think countries often are more able to find agreement on water quality even before they can agree on how to allocate or reallocate the water. And so there's often cooperation around water quality. Absolutely right.
Okay. Shall we turn to our second batch of questions? Let me first ask, is there someone here in the live audience who would like to ask a question? Please, introduce yourself and your institution, and then you'll be given a microphone. We will look forward to your question.
Hello, my name is Ashani. I'm a student at Georgetown University. My question was, so Mr. Yatena, you referred to the slogan of the Nile Basin Initiative, the one river, one people, one vision. And I'm curious whether you think there is one vision, or if we should even be working towards one vision, because it's clearly not one people, not one river. And in this process of trying to consolidate a vision, who have the winners been and who have the losers been?
Yeah.
Okay. Please.
All right. Okay. Thank you for your question. Yeah, the Nile Basin Initiative has the vision of equitable water sharing among the riparian countries, and the spirit of the Nile Basin Initiative is one river, one vision, one people. So far, however, I think it is hardly possible to say that the region, the basin is one river. They have one river, but the vision and the people are not coming together to use or to make most out of the resource of the Nile waters. So and it is very challenging to say that this country or this and that is benefiting a lot and less because we have to have the data, and then we have to look for other mechanisms to distinguish these things. But at the end of the day, since these countries are African countries, they have one resource. So are they going to let this river to be a curse for them or a resource? So that is the most important question that needs to be addressed. Yeah.
Please.
I think I might reframe the question and say, yes, perhaps there are different visions, but I would argue there are shared interests. And I think that's what we would focus on, whether it is in the Nile River Basin region or other contentious issues that, if you have the right stakeholders together, and whether they're grassroots or national leaders, there should be shared interests that can be the basis for further negotiation, even if there are different visions.
Thank you.
I don't think there can be peace if there isn't a common vision. It doesn't have to be everyone believing the same thing, but having that shared vision. I also think that there is often different people have different interests. It may be water for consumption, water for ag, water for navigation. And I think there's a basic question of how multifaceted is the vision or how singular is the vision. And I think that it's really important to get that multifaceted vision.
Thank you. Any other questions from please? Again, your name, institution, and your question.
Mark Giordano, also from Georgetown University. Two possibly related questions. One is, what interest does Ethiopia have, in your view, in coming to an agreement? What would it gain, being the upstream state that already now has the dam in place? And then the second part of the question is, how has, if at all, increased involvement from Gulf states in the politics and military of the Horn of Africa and beyond that affected Nile negotiations?
Thank you. Any other questions from Allison?
Thank you. I'm Allison Grunder, a diplomatic fellow with the Africa program at the Wilson Center. I just have been wondering if there's been any consultation between the negotiators in the Eastern Nile complex and other parts of the world where there have been these transboundary water issues, whether there's been any sharing of experience, lessons learned, success stories.
Thank you. Do we have other questions from our live audience? No. So, thank you. Who would like to address any of these first?
I think on the question of shared experiences, one of the comments I made in my presentation was the problem of seams and subsidiarity. And I think one way that the United States has sought to address that is to appoint special envoys. And so we have appointed to deal with the Horn of Africa a special envoy for the Horn of Africa, both Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman and now Ambassador David Satterfield are individuals with tremendous experience in other regions of the world, whether it's been Europe or the Middle East. In Ambassador Feltman's case, he was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs of the United Nations. So I think one way we've tried to do it is to bring individuals who have that experience and put them in. And just finally, on the issue of special envoys, that's when you have this sort of question of, well, what institutions are most effective, whether it's the Nile Basin Initiative or, which REC do you deal with? The United States, again, tries to overcome this by appointing special envoys. And so we not only just have a special envoy for for the Horn of Africa, we've appointed in the past special envoys for Sudan, South Sudan, and the Great Lakes. And other countries are doing the same, right? We've seen China, for example, in the last few days appoint Shui Bing as their Chinese special envoy for the Horn of Africa. So other countries are also following suit, I suppose.
Thank you. Please.
Okay. Let me comment on some of the questions. The
Can
first
you
one.
move a little closer to your microphone for
Okay.
us, please?
Okay, so what is Ethiopia's interest on the dam? I think as a riparian state, as like other riparian states, in the ongoing tripartite negotiations or trilateral negotiations, Ethiopia has been reflecting or saying that Ethiopia will not affect the construction of the Grand Renaissance Dam will not affect the other riparian or lower riparian countries. That is the last thing that the government is saying. The last thing to do is affecting water, the downflow of water to Sudan and Egypt. So more cooperation and integration and talks will definitely help these countries in reaching some kind of agreement. The increased involvement of the Gulf states, I think I have to look into that because I haven't incorporated such approach in my research. So I will look into that. Thank you.
Thank you.
2 quick points. The consultation between negotiators in the Eastern Nile complex and other basins. I don't know about the formal side, but on the women negotiators that we've been involved with, there have been quite a few discussions with other basins, including the Orange River Basin and connections with women negotiators in South Africa and Eswatini, as well as in Central Asia. So that's more on the civil society side, but trying to engage in that process. I think I'd like to flip around your question and say, now that the dam is built and is being filled, why wouldn't Ethiopia want to negotiate something? You know, it has a lot of leverage. And so I think that there may actually be more opportunities for some sort of arrangement now that they have largely what they want.
Yeah, I would just say on the first question, you know, what does Ethiopia have to gain from an agreement? I obviously can't speak on behalf of Ethiopia, but I think it's important to recognize that no country benefits from armed conflict, right? And so our position is that obviously the 3 states need to find a negotiated resolution drawing on their common interests and common principles. And it goes back to the observation I made in my presentation that African countries have agency, right? We can't impose a solution on the states involved. And so, you know, on the GERD issue, I'll just say the United States is an observer in an African Union-led process. And, you know, that's our view of that issue.
Thank you. Anything else on this batch of questions? Let me move on to our second batch of questions coming in from our guests online. Where was the one? What is the impact of the proliferation of small arms in the Eastern Nile Basin, and how does that, or does it, and if it does, how does that complicate shared water governance efforts? And if it does, what are your recommendations on this? That's question number 1. Question number 2. How can shared resource agreements proactively plan for and deal with potential spoilers, such as a terrorist group or terrorist incident? And question number 3 from our second batch. How can international interventions balance efficacy with respect for autonomy and avoid exacerbating existing domestic fragilities? So how can international interventions balance efficacy with respect for autonomy? Which of you 3 distinguished gentlemen may I invite to speak?
On the issue of small arms proliferation, I think I'll just interject with, you know, if you expand the aperture a little bit and look beyond the Eastern River Basin to the Nile River Basin, I think one good example of where the international community has worked well with different countries and the United Nations system is the demobilization of former fighters that went from Rwanda to Eastern Congo, right? And so since the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, you've had hundreds of former Rwandan FDLR, Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, fighters from Eastern Congo be demobilized, going through this disarmament, demobilization, reintegration program sponsored by the World Bank, where their small arms are taken, where they're given a small stipend, where they're reintegrated into Rwandan society. And over the last few decades, it's actually been, I would argue, a net plus, obviously, for the security of both Eastern Congo and neighboring Rwanda, to the point where a lot of these troops now contribute to UN peacekeeping. Right? I mean, Rwanda, I think, is at least the 6th largest, perhaps even greater than that, contributor of UN peacekeeping forces. And so it's taken what could be a net liability, militias, and with proper resources and support from the international community, made it a success story.
Thank you. Please.
Okay. On small arms and light weapons, the proliferation of these small arms and light weapons is one of the challenges in the Eastern Nile Basin. Specifically, from the Ethiopian perspective, as a country, these small arms and light weapons, they directly came through 2 fronts. I can say 3 fronts. The first one is through Sudan, and second one is through Kenya, and third one is through Somalia. So this proliferation of small arms and light weapons definitely is challenging peace, not only in the region, but also at national and local levels.
And do any of you have specific recommendations on what governments or regional organizations or continent-wide organizations or international organizations should do to address these?
For many of the countries, I mean, the United States has suspended formally the export of defense articles and services. So under 126.1 of ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, there's a series of countries under which it's U.S. policy that we would not approve sending them weapons. Ethiopia is on that list, for example, as of November of last year because of human rights concerns related to the ongoing crisis there. But a number of countries in the region are on that list, and we've encouraged other arms exporting countries throughout the world to take similar steps. That if we have countries on what we call the 126.1 ITAR list, in other words, we wouldn't export weapons to them, we hope that other countries that export weapons take the same steps to restrict those sales.
What about the argument, let me play devil's advocate, that it doesn't matter about selling any more weapons, there are enough weapons on the continent to cause enough problems that as noble and as good a policy as that might be for the United States and international partners to do, what do we do about all the guns that are there already?
It can always get worse. So I think this is important for not making it worse.
Fair. But
yeah, I can't speak for the, there's, in the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs at the State Department, there are a number of programs devoted to small arms, light weapons, demining, in particular humanitarian demining. So there are concrete efforts that are being made in some countries.
responses to some of the other, please.
Maybe some recommendation on the proliferation of small arms, how
Please.
to control the proliferation of small arms. Usually in Africa, aftermath of a certain war or civil war, there would be an ongoing and like DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. So disarmament being one of the key pillar of the DDR, I think the international organizations, including the African Union, are closely working with the national governments to disarm those combatants. So that would be one solution, working aggressively on disarming the combatants and reintegrating those combatants to the community.
I've been a little quiet on this because I think it's a real problem, and I think it's very hard. It's very hard to find a solution because the reason for small arms is a weakness in governance, that people take the law into their own hands, at least as they see it. And when you have expansive areas without effective government presence or corruption or ethnic rivalries trumping objective rule of law, it's very hard to convince people to give up their small weapons. And so I think that until we really build governance and rule of law, it's going to be, it'll always be whack-a-mole, and weapons will find a way in.
Okay, what about the other questions? The shared resource agreements proactively plan for and deal with potential spoilers such as a terrorist threat. How do shared resource agreements influence?
They don't.
That's an okay answer. I mean, that's why we're here. We're here. We don't have to have an answer.
They should, but they don't.
Do you concur, disagree?
I would just say there was a nexus between disputes over resources and terrorism, and so it's not the Eastern Nile River Basin, but if you look at Somalia, for example, there's an argument that al-Shabaab's use of charcoal is something that they're deriving revenue from.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely, and I mean, al-Shabaab's getting revenues from bananas, from fisheries, from a lot of it's diversified, but the question is, the international agreements governing these resources very rarely address the spoilers, especially when it comes to water.
Okay, and what about the question of balancing balancing the efficacy versus and respect for autonomy in international interventions? How can international interventions balance efficacy with respect for autonomy and avoid exacerbating existing domestic fragilities, particularly in the Eastern Nile River Basin? Please.
Okay.
No, please.
All right. Specifically, the international community, I mean, looking at previous water agreements has helped a lot. For example, we can cite a good example of the Pakistan-India water agreement, which was led by the director of the World Bank. So these individuals, they have showed their intelligence and they have leadership to help these two countries to come up with that agreement in 1960s. But still, the international organizations, they have their own vested interests. So bracketing out such vested interest in these agreements would be very difficult, but still they have to show some measure of influence on water agreements through acting as impartial and
I'd like to kind of build off of actually what Eric said earlier about agency and autonomy. I don't, as much as we need these institutions to be more effective, unless there is ownership and respect for autonomy, it's not going to work. You can twist arms only so much. You can push hard only so much. And then you get a backlash, which actually is more damaging. So I think that part of it is taking what you can and continuing to push forward. I think part of it is showing it's education. It's kind of the question about negotiators in other basins. Look how others do it. Gee, isn't that interesting? And then finding the champions within those countries, because these countries are not homogeneous. There are some that want to do this, there are others that don't, and empowering and supporting those individuals that are pushing for more effective solutions, I think can be a really good solution, a really good strategy, and similarly is being ready to move when they come into power. That to the extent that, and the US government has done this for a long time, often working through civil society. And then there's a quick political shift and things take off. So I think the long game is important, but I think that unless you're respecting autonomy, it's going to be a very difficult game, even if it's not effective yet.
Yara, did you have reaction or thoughts?
Yeah. On local ownership of agreements or shared water agreements, obviously the problem is the problem. It belongs to these riparian countries, so they need to agree on some compromise. So it should come from themselves. So it should come from themselves. Otherwise, it will be like if it comes from the international organizations or from international communities, then it will not work, and it will definitely also affect the sovereignty of these riparian countries. So definitely, this water resource sharing and other water resource sharing should be left to the riparians to discuss, to talk about it, but there should be help, there should be facilitation and intervention in some way, so that they will do their best in coming up with, in sorting out their problems. Yeah.
Terrific. We have another question. Are there lessons learned from other African river basins in terms of governance that could be adapted for the Nile River Basin? And are there lessons learned from other African river basins in terms of governments that we could adapt, that could be adapted to the Nile River Basin?
I think there are, in terms of very specific issues around, say, public engagement or transparency or data sharing. I think that the Nile is complicated in part because of the size, the number of countries that are involved, in part because of the sub-basins, that it's not just, you're not dealing with like the Senegal River and OMVS. You have the sub-basins that have different, there are different dynamics between Egypt and the southern Nile countries. So I think that I don't have, yes, on the small things, they're important, but on the big question of how do you get Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan to agree on a fundamental binding framework, I don't have a good answer to that.
That's an okay answer in and of itself.
Yeah.
Please.
I agree, actually. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to to these problems. But still, I think talks, negotiations still works. So that's the most important thing. So these countries should work out through negotiations and talks. Yeah.
The United States on the GERD issue supports an African Union-led process that lowers tensions, facilitates productive negotiations, and enhances regional cooperation. And so we've called on all parties to refrain from making any statements or taking any action that could jeopardize the negotiation process. And we've called for all parties to commit themselves to a negotiated solution that is acceptable to all parties. I think some of the historical disputes that you highlighted, Jared, earlier, arise from borders that were drawn or not drawn in the 19th century. And so it's important for the stakeholders themselves to arrive at a negotiated solution.
Okay, we've got one final question that's come in from online, and then as you're thinking about this question, I also will want to call on each of you to make a final, what are the important messages you'd like to leave with, or important message that you would like to leave with our audience today. But the final question is, how do relationships between the individual leaders of these different countries in the basin complicate peace-building efforts? And is there any hope for progress until these individuals resolve their own conflicts? So the relationships of the individuals, how do they complicate or facilitate?
I mean, relationships matter. I mean, this is, I think, a point that I alluded to in my presentation, that if you look at, for example, cooperation between Rwanda and Congo now, it would not have occurred under President Kabila. And so leadership matters, whether it's a change from Kabila to Tshisekedi in Congo, from Magufuli to Hassan in Tanzania. And so, yes, it's a key aspect.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah. Individual leaders, excuse me, individual leaders and water dispute. Yeah, the individual leaders. Like looking at, for example, the three countries, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. During, for example, the al-Bashir regime, there is an open engagement between the al-Bashir regime and the Ethiopian government. Now with the change of regime, so the Sudanese are now colliding with, aligning with Egyptian position. So in the beginning of when Ethiopia announced that Ethiopia is constructing dam on the Blue Nile, Sudan appreciated the dam because it will reduce flood, and it also agreed that Ethiopia has the right to construct a dam on the Blue Nile. But now, if you look at the current situation, it's quite different. So individual relationships matters in resolving conflicts. Yeah.
Final point, Mr. Brook.
You need to look outside the region also. I still think that there are some real security risks if we don't manage potential food shortages coming out of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And it's both on grains and also on vegetable oils. I think that this is, it's not going to solve the problem, but it can exacerbate it. And I think we need to be alert to that.
Thank you. Mr. Wong.
I would say if we looked at the Nile River Basin as a whole, there's just a number of overlapping challenges that exacerbate each other, whether they're humanitarian, political, economic, and engagement by the United States and the international community is going to be important to help address them.
Mr. Yared.
Yeah, looking at the Eastern Nile Basin, the peacebuilding challenges are very myriad, very difficult to address. But these peace-building challenges are also interlinked, so that it's very helpful to analyze them together, so that we get a full picture of it, and then we can come up with a more comprehensive approach to address these peace-building challenges.
Thank you. So we've learned a lot today. I've learned a lot, and I hope that our in-person and online audience joins me in saying that we have learned an enormous amount from our three distinguished speakers. Very simply, it's complicated, it's big. There are actors at different levels who play key roles, be they the individual leaders of countries in the Nile River Basin, be they the leaders of civil society across regions. Women matter, and that is not only as the U.S. government representative commented that women matter, and we would like to see a more egalitarian representation of women in government positions, but as Mr. Brook also pointed out, it's women in civil society who, across nationalities, are also able to get things done. It's complicated because of climate, and a lot of the previous work, what you've all talked about, previous agreements, previous work, previous ways to look at the challenges of peace building and general security in the Nile River Basin has not really accommodated the influence of climate change. And that anything, as we look forward, we absolutely need to look at imparting flexibility into any discussions and into any agreements as climate becomes a huge factor. And climate, and I would add then outside pressures on the region will also play a role. as we said, the Wilson Center is here to provide a forum for folks to put ideas out there on the table, to discuss them, to bring our academics and our policymakers and our experts together. And I think that we should, I would like to invite you to join me in thanking our scholar, our policymaker, and our expert in giving us a very, very rich and educational discussion on this Wednesday afternoon. Folks, thank you very much. And I would like to remind you all that tomorrow we have another presentation, and on April 5th, is that, I'm getting a thumbs up from the background, so please, if you are watching out there in the, on the World Wide Web via the webcast, please be sure to register for the next presentations. These are the 3 scholars who are here resident at the Wilson Center with the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding. A huge thank you to the Africa team led by the amazing Dr. Monde Muyangwa and her incredible team, who have done a spectacular job in preparing this seminar, this workshop, for all of the participants. And an extra special shout out to the Wilson Center team, the audiovisual team, and all of the folks who make the technical stuff look so easy for us. So again, thank you all very much for coming. We will look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.